afternoon, everyone. We are here for a plenary session on post-secularities or multiple secularities. I want to begin by acknowledging that the country we meet on for this World Congress is called Norm. It's the home of the Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri Wai-Wurrung people. We acknowledge their sovereignty and pay our respects to their elders and ancestors. We have 3 papers from 3 different continents for this plenary, and each speaker is going to have about 20 minutes. So they will go in order, and my only job is to kind of keep time, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So with that, I will call Professor Salvatore to come up and introduce him.
Thank you, Bandana. I'm thanking also the organizers of this session, Geoffrey Pliers and then Eloisa Martin. This is, as you know, the first of 2 plenary sessions dedicated to the topic of secularities, multiple secularities, and post-secularity. And we just start by saying that secularity is a quite slippery concept. And this is because the thematic span associated with secularity can be almost as broad as modernity. And indeed, in the history of Western thought and social sciences, secularity does often index modernity and defines modernity. So we can see modernity and secularity as the main threads within the same semantic web through which the colonial and imperial West recognized itself as being ahead of the rest, ahead of the pack in the entire world, precisely for being modern and secular. So you can see that there is a strange tautology in this type of semantic network. And this happened in spite of the fact that, you know, there was a big role played by organized religions in support of Western colonialism, like through, you know, the Christian missions. But as we know, the idea of a Western monopoly of modernity has given way to paradigms of multiple modernities for at least 30 years now. And clearly, this is not, you know, the paradigm of multiple modernities is not uncontroversial. But it does include concepts of Islamic or Islamic hate modernities. You know, Islamic hate is the adjective that wants to include Islam-related cultures at large, more than just Islam as a religion. And it took a bit longer also for the idea of multiple secularities to develop, and also for Islamic or Islamic inflections of secularity to start being discussed explicitly. To my reckoning, this happened less than a decade ago. And I was lucky to have the chance to participate in a project titled Multiple Secularities, directed by Monica Bolrabsar, who is the first speaker of today's panel, which was interestingly subtitled Beyond the West and Beyond Modernity. This was launched at the University of Leipzig in 2016. Of course, I leave it to Monica to decide whether she wants to say more about that. But what I found really rewarding was that it was based on a collaboration between historians, social scientists, and scholars of various religious traditions of the East and West. And quite interestingly, for me at least, Islam took the center stage quite from the beginning. And yet, I think we should honestly acknowledge that this, you know, the one image of Islam still dominant also in the academia and among the social scientists, who, at least those who are not specialists of Islam, is the image of a Muslim world dwelling in a kind of holistic, totalizing religious culture for quite a long time, until the colonial West encroached upon it, particularly from the 18th century onward. And this was a Muslim world that only then, and quite reluctantly, according to this simplified cliche, only then, and with a lot of resistance, received, as it were, from the West, seeds of secular institutions and of a secular culture. And this is really what we can call sociological Orientalism. And this is why the sociology of multiple and diverse secularities I'm addressing here, with regard to the Muslim majority world, is located on a critical fault line in the historical emergence of social science paradigms. Because this sociology of multiple secularities is part and parcel of the work we all need to reflexively decolonize key sociological paradigms. In other words, the sociology of secularities intervenes in what are more than just residues of sociological Orientalism. So let's take stock for a moment. So on the one hand, it is difficult to deny that the notion itself of secularity continues to evoke a Euro-American imperial and cultural hegemony over the Muslim colony and post-colony. And yet, on the other hand, in the very same discursive context, in the Muslim majority world, where many scholars, intellectuals, and socio-political actors distance themselves from the dangers of Western manufactured secularity, in that same context, the idea that another secularity is possible seems to blossom and feed an aspiration, namely to find specifically Islamicate inflections of the secular that do not feed into the Western colonial project of secularity. And this aspiration seems to be shared by quite a few authors recently, although one might argue that it goes back to the beginnings of Islamic reformism in the second half of the 19th century. The most recent and consistent manifestation of such an aspiration that I could find is in a book published last year entitled Islam and the Trajectory of Globalization. Its author is political scientist and political theorist Luay Safi from the Center of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. And he writes in the book, and I'm quoting, "Undoubtedly, Arab secularists have given secularism a bad name in the Arab world. But this has not ended the struggle to resuscitate a form of secular tradition in which the Islamically grounded values, equality, diversity, and religious freedom are interwoven to approximate a post-Islamist and post-secular space." So here we can see that the secular is tied to the greater good and is expected to cover the same values that Islam as a religious tradition also cultivates and pursues, at least in the understanding of this tradition by Muslim reformists. And this type of move would herald, according to Safi, something like the blurring of the sharp dichotomy between Islamism and secularism as political ideologies. Of course, we are obviously still very far from that. So, how can we approach the idea of an Islamic secularity? Is it an aspiration for the future or also an inherited tradition, as suggested by Safi? But also, would secularity be the right name for that tradition and or aspiration, given the association of the word and the idea of secularity with Western imperialism and colonialism? I think that as sociologists, we should make an effort to help responding such questions by embracing a longue durée within Muslim majority societies, also in collaboration with historians and scholars within Islamic studies. And I'm suggesting here that we should focus on processes that produced ideas of what might be better called civility than secularity, something which is dialectically twinned with religion rather than sharply differentiated from it. And I'll explain why. And this is my slideshow. It's a bit minimalist. It's just one slide where you see two semantic networks or traditions We have the one that originates with religion, okay? And then the alternative one I'm going to tell you about. And then on the third line, something that suggests the kind of relation between these two, which is not a relation which we might call a dichotomy. Now, just a couple of centuries after the onset of the Islamic civilization, these two major narratives emerged more or less simultaneously. The first one was related to religion, of course, to the sources of Islam, I mean, the scriptures, the Quran, and especially the corpus of the Prophet Muhammad's exemplary deeds and sayings, I mean, the hadith. The other one was the courtly narrative of adab, so something that ultimately means civility, but we will approach this step by step. And both traditions consisted of intersecting registers of narration, habitualization, and ultimately normative production. So hadith is the label given to the increasingly systematic body of reports and narrations originating in the activity of Prophet Muhammad, very often in interaction with his companions. And this constitutes the bulk of the database of the normative system that is often subsumed under the umbrella category of the Sharia, because the Quran does not include so many rules. So the hadith body took shape as a normative tradition originating from prophetic action and speech. But on the other hand, the origins of adab are much more fluid and here hybrid, because this genre or this narrative evoked pre-Islamic, sometimes Arab, sometimes Persian narratives whose origin was not prophetic. So adab ended up designating something similar to the quintessence of practical wisdom accumulated over the generations, with a focus on on civilized interaction, on savoir-vivre, something which is based on the moral consciousness that we live in a world of difference, not in a kind of homogeneous community. And this idea almost incorporates an implicit sociology of knowledge, a sociology of how this practical knowledge or know-how, this kind of savoir-faire, was produced. Almost a kind of moral sociology, or at least moral philosophy. So it represented a type of knowledge and practice, strictly speaking, not originated in revelation or prophetic speech. So it was primarily cultivated by people in royal courts and literati, and who were quite integrated in ruling bureaucracies. And this is exactly when adab became associated with another emerging concept linking life conduct to the ways of governance and statecraft, and this is siyasa. I mean, siyasa means politics nowadays. But that was the origin of this idea. And in a remarkable book that is being published as we speak by historian Hayrettin Yücesoy, which is titled Disenchanting the Caliphate, we are presented with a creative and open-ended process unfolding during the Abbasid Caliphate of old. And this process bundled relational practices of power knowledge into what might call the rather secular discipline of political civility. Now, Yücesoy calls this tradition unabashedly adab siyasa, which is civility and statecraft, even something close to governmentality, something that it is instilled into the individuals, from the inside out. I mean, it comes from the top, but it educates the members of the community in a way to self-regulate themselves. And it clearly comes from the top, but also trickles down. So basically, this is the idea that quite, at least not too long after its onset, the caliphate started to disenchant itself, to build a non-religious basis for its legitimacy through this adab siyasa tradition. And this was the work of socio-political elites, but also a deeper cultural work that was transmitted to the culture also of religious personnel, including the Sufi mystical brotherhoods, which were no marginal organizations because they built the mainstream of Islamic associational forms for quite a long time. And these brotherhoods were open to both religious personnel and lay people from various social backgrounds, including popular classes. So we can say that in this development of civility as being both political and cultural, but also coexisting and often intertwining with religion, we see the work of something that has been called a Barzakh epistemology. Bruce Lawrence called it Barzakh epistemology, and Barzakh, is something which originates in the Quran itself. It's the confluence of the two seas. Yeah, Marj al-Bahrain, something like an isthmus. It's not a barrier. Now, we can find a lot of resonances to this concept of civility outside the West. In a book titled Bonds of Civility, covering medieval and early modern pre-colonial Japan, sociologist Eiko Ikegami wrote, and I'm quoting, "Sociologically, civility might be thought as a ritual technology of interpersonal exchanges that shaped a kind of intermediate zone of social relationships between the intimate and the hostile," unquote. So it's the technique that enables to handle diversity within the broader community. And interestingly, in the narrative of this book, although there is no mentioning of religion itself as the other of civility, we see that religious practices and religious personnel play an important role, moving into and out of the picture, without affecting the way one conceptualizes the process of creating bonds of civility. And now the final argument in favor of embracing the notion of civility in an Islamic context is due to the fact that much more recently, in a colonial setting, in Islamic context, the discourse of adab siyasa started to intersect explicitly the family of keywords denoting the quality of being civil and urban, like in the adjective madani madaniya, from Medina, and you can see it here, Tamaddun, which denotes the process itself of becoming civil, almost sounding like the civilizing process theorized by sociologist Norbert Elias. So fast forward to basically now, the contemporary trigger of the heuristic attempt to focus on civility as a key marker of this kind of dialectical interaction with religious norms or symbols was also reflected in aspirations and calls during the Arab Spring for a type of state that is neither military nor religious, and was called a dawla al-madaniya, a civil state, as distinct from both a religious state and a military state. And that call was remarkably voiced also from within post-Islamist intellectual circles by thinkers who often did not even abjure their Islamist identity, but saw the new developments as natural outcomes of their emphasis on rights and justice, not unlike what we saw with the quote of Luai Safi. And very last, we can see that this discourse on adab as civility is also becoming very popular in Southeast Asia, in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, where it's both integrated in religious discourse as a kind of way to avoid excesses in the calls for the application of Sharia, and generally speaking also to invite various religious groups in inter-religious and multi-religious contexts, especially like in Malaysia, to interact with each other by acknowledging the importance of difference. So this kind of dialectic of adab and Sharia is being reconstructed nowadays in several Muslim majority countries and can produce ideas of civility. So this is my last statement. I think that in this development of civility as coexisting and often intertwining with religion, whilst also keeping a principled autonomy from religion, we see a Barzakh epistemology at works that survived the colonial epistemicide and resists the patrolling of boundaries of a purported universal secularity with religious traditions and forms of expression. Okay, much gratitude everybody, and bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Professor Armando Salvatore from McGill University in Canada. Our next speaker is Professor Anindita Chakravarti. She's from the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur, India.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to share my thoughts and my work on the concept of secularity. My paper is titled Postsecularity, Multiple Secularities, and Post-Coloniality, Investigating the Indian Conundrum. Since the broader framework of the secularities debate will be addressed and has been addressed by the other panelists, I keep my presentation focused on the post-colonial career of the concept. The Indian conundrum is my case study. Now in India, while the debate around secularism as an ideology has dominated and informed much of the public and academic discourse, the career of the concept as an analytical category has remained checkered. India's tryst with the ideal of secular runs deep, rooted in the creation of the nation state carved out of British India along the religious lines of control. The newly independent constitutional democracy had to work its way around, first, the constitutional expectation of religious freedom, and second, the boundaries between the domain of the religious and secular. And it necessarily led to the question, what constitutes religion? And it also categorized religious communities as political communities of majority and minorities. The secular was the part of a self-image of the modern nation state committed to progress, equality, and shift away from ascriptive privileges. It was a political necessity. Now, since the 1990s, as many of you are aware, that there is a spate of studies that began to interrogate the monolithic understanding of secularism, thus providing a picture of secularism and its cognate concepts that are better fitted to explain the actual practices of the ideal that stood for a shorthand of modernity and progress. Scholars in anthropology, sociology, religious studies, and political theory vigorously participated in this debate. Talal Asad, Akhil Bilgrami, William Connolly, Winifred Sullivan, Saba Mahmood are some of the noted names, along with many others. They showed how religion and secular was co-constitutive and interdependent rather than oppositional. This wave was joined by the post-9/11 political exigency, where the discourse fixated on the resurgence of religion. The concept of post-secularity in this context gained traction and meant to offer a toolkit, the right pair of intellectual spectacles to correct the myopia caused by the secularization theory. It is interesting to note that though the current wave of theorizing around the concept of secularity was situated in the post-colonial context, in India, the debate somehow doesn't seem to move beyond the 1990s polemics around communalism, fundamentalism versus secularism. In a way, the electoral victory of the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, to power, political urgency replaced analytical scrutiny. So what I plan to do very briefly in this brief time, I map the debate in India on this question on three key registers: the idea of separation and its impossibility; second, secularism as rights and justice; and third, following from that, the increasing judicialization of the question of religion and its aftermath. In the end, I argue that the frame of multiple secularities offers not an idea of multicultural relativism, but a conceptual tool to identify that it is a multi-value idea. First, the idea of separation and its impossibility. The secularism debate has, in the Indian context, for the longest time revolved around the dualism of its absolute political necessity on one hand, and its irrelevance, if not impossibility, on the other. Both the advocates and critique of secularism, associated primarily with the separation of religion from state politics and the concomitant idea of its privatization. For these scholars, since separation was a means to check communalism and fundamentalism, religion must be restricted to the private domain of social life, separated from state and detached from politics. So there's a long list of scholars who work from this perspective, but there has been others who were quick to point out the difficulty of achieving this goal, given that society remains furiously religious. The critiques of the separation theory, Ashish Nandiante and Madan, they upheld that religion cannot be separated from the polity in a society like India because of a hierarchical relationship that exists between religion and politics, the latter being encompassed by the former. For them, secularism in India is not in crisis because we are not trying hard enough, but because of its deep conceptual flaw. The titles of these polemical academic papers read as Secularism in Its Place by T.N. Madan, or Secularism Out of Its Place by Paul Brass. I come to the second register of this debate. As a conceptually productive move that helped the debate to go beyond this possibility of or impossibility of separation, came from political theorists who highlighted that the secular polity was not a result of separation between religion and state, but because the state granted its citizens individual rights, which included their religious rights. For Gurpreet Mahajan, secularism thereby represented two things: assurance of religious rights to all communities and the guarantee that the religious rights of some do not become a cause of discrimination for others or non-religious people, and vice versa. Also, moving beyond the trope of separation, there is Rajiv Bhargav's work of the idea of contextual secularism, a multi-value concept shot through with internal discord that addresses deep religious diversity. For Bhargav, the Indian version has taken forward the idea of secularism because, from the very beginning, under an integral link with nationalism and democracy, it has had to be explicitly tied to citizenship rights, including the rights of religious minorities. The concept of the secular state for scholars such as Bhargav and Neera Chandu has been one of principal distance from all religion. Now, since rights can only be addressed through laws and the legal machinery, the courts have over the years emerged as a site of contestation over the key ideas of religion as well as secular. As we look out from the court precincts, instead of principal distance, what we find is intense engagement. This paradoxical turn has been noted by scholars. I would like to mention Anuradha Nidam and Rajeswari Sundarajan's work, as well as Winifred Sullivan's work in the context of USA. With increasing judicialization of the religious domain, where the judges become the arbitrator of religious rights, drawing the boundaries between religion and its other, determining whether certain beliefs and practices qualify as essential practice of the religion is in question, the courts in the post-colonial nation state emerged as the key sites of these contestations. The site of secularity question has therefore moved to the precinct of the court. And this brings us to the third register of secularity, which is judicialization and its aftermath. Scholars writing on the court's intervention on religious rights have commented on the unintended consequences of the continuous judicialization of the religious domain. In his book, Articles of Faith, Religion, Secularism, and the Indian Supreme Court, Ranujai Sen has astutely shown how the Supreme Court's rulings have furthered the reformist idea of the Indian state at the expense of religious freedom and neutrality, and at the same time, the court has become an inadvertent ally of the Hindu nationalists in their aggressive demand for homogenization and uniformity. Sen draws on Mark Gallanter's insight that in India, it was the reformist judiciary that was called to decide what constituted religious rights and thereby religion itself. This led to two things: continuous judicialization of religion post-1950s and the judge's unmitigated power to decide when and how the boundaries between the religious and non-religious were to be drawn. If the judiciary was the instrument through which Hinduism was to be reformed and unintendedly homogenized, the same process had a very different effect when the community in question are the religious minorities. How the techniques and categories of modern governance affect religious minorities as the ideal of secular enters the domain of religious reform and criminal law is best seen in the recent spate of judicial verdicts, and the latest one being banning the headscarf in educational institution in the southern state of Karnataka in India. In her book, Religious Difference in a Secular Age, a Minority Report, Saba Mahmood builds on Assad's insight in, as she shows, how this, by solidifying religious divisions and emphasizing differences, political secularism itself has heightened tension in the post-colonial countries like Egypt. The modern state and secular political rationality that animates it, she argues, has paradoxically made religion a more rather than less significant part of the lives and subjectivities of those who belong to both minority and majority communities. As a result, rather than eliminate religious tension, discrimination, and injustice, these regulations have intensified interreligious inequality and conflict, the valuation of certain aspects of religious life over others, and the precarious position of the country's religious minorities. Mahmood's intervention in the debate offers a very different picture of principled distance and desired transformation by the reformist state. The lens that critical anthropological writings have offered is to focus on practices rather than on postulates. Next, I discuss whether the insights of multiple secularities frame have something to offer to recenter the debate as it moves from normative formalism to substantive messiness of practice, the lifeblood of sociological investigation. So this is my last section where I talk about the secular and its plurality of signifiers. The concept of multiple secularities, why is it important? Because it begins with the possibility of combination of ways that religion, national politics, and the claims of religious groups and secular agents they bring to the public sphere. So they don't kind of spend time whether it's culturally inauthentic or a Western import, but it focuses on the boundaries between religion and other spheres that are negotiated, challenged, and redrawn at different historical periods across national boundaries. It uses the idea of the Weberian ideal type, which I have found very helpful, and thereby it enables mapping the changing conceptual currency of the term. So in India, it was in the mid-1980s, in the wake of another judgment on Muslim family law, the Shahbanu judgment and its aftermath, that the term secular acquired a conceptual vocabulary of minority appeasement. The fact that it was possible to turn a constitutional promise into a partisan category affirms that secularity is actually a lexical concept with many signifiers. Multiple secularities, with its insistence on cultural meanings, underlying the differentiation between religion and non-religious spheres, offers an analytical peg that foregrounds this journey. When would a particular signifier would get prioritized depends on the specific historical national context and the political theology that animates it. If the idea that the secular would encompass and govern religion, now the language of religion is deployed to determine ways of being secular and pseudo-secular. Do I have any time, or do I take questions later? Yeah. The ideal of secularism allows religious minorities, if the ideal of secularism allows religious minorities to be appeased with their right to practice religion-based family laws, such freedom was now replaced by the secular project of subjection of religion to rule of law. In a recent book, The Secular Need, Islamic Law and State Governance in Contemporary India, on non-state Islamic legal actors, Jeffrey Redding has explored the complicated knot of Indian secularism and Indian Islam that has developed over a period of time, rooted in the politics of majoritarianism. Now the question arises that if the concept of multiple secularities turns its analytical gaze from political ideological project to an intellectual question of locating the boundaries, are we looking for variation, alternatives to a Eurocentric axiomatic model that was Saba Mahmood's critique of multiple secularities? But I would like to argue that, in fact, it is not that. Again, it is a lexical concept, a multi-value concept that untethered the European departure points. And in doing so, it recognizes and accommodates plurality and difference. It recognizes that religion is a social and public practice. And as an analytical and substantive category, multiple secularity offers the possibility of acknowledging religious difference, as well as historically evolving nature of the relationship without reducing them to a constitutional or normative ideals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. And the next speaker is Professor Monika Wohlrab-Saar from the University of Leipzig in Germany.
The PowerPoint is not yet. Here, okay. Yeah. I also would like to start thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me and us to this plenary. It has been a pleasure to work with these colleagues, both of these colleagues, for a while, and a privilege also, and it's a good occasion to see them again. No, it doesn't move forward. Can some technician? No, okay. This session deals with conflicting interpretations with regard to the secular in present societies and their past. And these conflicting interpretations, post-secularity or multiple secularities, I think are based on an unease with a different focus, partly with classical secularization theories and their teleological assumptions, partly with secularist politics or normativities, but partly also with a dominant critique of secularism that has been very prevalent in the last decades. The different approaches that are addressed in this plenary both try to cope with the changing situation of religion in present societies, especially with religious plurality, but also with secular religious contestations. They try to cope with the role of religious minorities in these societies and with the scientific and political ways to address this situation. It doesn't move. No, I have this one.
Yeah, green button.
Yeah, try it. Oh, no, okay. I will deal with the post-secularity approach first, which I'm not part of, but which has been very influential nevertheless. And I think we can distinguish at least between two approaches. The first I would call is the simultaneity approach, which addresses the simultaneity of ongoing secularization and the new awareness of the presence of religion, which was started by the famous talk by Jürgen Habermas in 2001. Both of this is especially addressed to growing religious plurality, diversity, and to the migration experience, especially in Europe. The second approach, which is quite influential, I think addresses a fundamental normative crisis of secular modernity. This is partially in line with post-colonial critical religion, critical secularity, critiques of secularism, and the secular religious binary. It goes along often with notions of post-modernity, but also with identitarian or culturalist trends in society, but also in the humanities, which address the incomparability of the developments in different cultures, and which address the problem of using certain scientific categories for comparative purposes, scientific categories that are were developed in the West, like religion or secularity. In this perspective, secularism is being criticized for its inability to cope with plurality. Anindita has mentioned this already. It goes along often with a positive evaluation of religion, of transcendence, of enchantment, and is mostly dealt with in the fields of philosophy, of theology, but also in international relations. And it goes along with a normative plea for a post-secular ethics. This normativity provokes confessions, and I give you just two examples of confessions of that type. One, it's the famous book by William Connolly, Why I'm Not a Secularist, and a response by Amir Mufti, Why I'm Not a Post-Secularist. Some other authors, which I find quite interesting, try to grasp constellations in which the political and the religious are indissolubly intertwined. And I mentioned several Israeli authors who address that Israel, the notion of the sacred land or the notion of the Jewish state, is supported by the secular as well as the religious part of the population. And both of them argue, or all of these argue, for a post-secular ethics in order to grapple with this constellation, without, however, and I think it's quite interesting and quite important, without questioning the need of a secular state, which is not being accomplished in Israel. For other authors like Pasha, arguing from a decidedly political Islamic position, he would say that post-secularity doesn't go far enough because its starting point remains secular, and he questions for treating like different models of the state, Islamic states and secular states, like on the same level. In general, one needs to say this is not one approach, obviously. However, I think the terminology of the post-secular insinuates the end of something. It insinuates the end of secularity, and thereby I would say risks to become ideological. The multiple secularities approach that we developed, referring to multiple modernities, obviously in Leipzig, long time, more than a decade ago. In the meantime, it has been addressed by both of the speakers before me. It started with a little research project that I did with Marian Burchardt, and then it turned into the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences, which is called Multiple Secularities Beyond the West, Beyond Modernities. I need to say it's not an integrated research group, but an Institute of Advanced Study under a thematic umbrella, which invites scholars from different parts of the world to contribute with their research to the general question. In principle, the multiple secularities approach can be described as an attempt to develop an empirical, sociological, historical framework which tries to enable comparative research in a global perspective. And it was also from the very beginning inspired by the wish to avoid the normative battles that are going on and have been going on in the research on religion and secularization, especially about the terminology of secularism. Therefore, we avoided secularism as a normative concept and use the term secularity as an analytical term. I'm sure that that we did not manage to avoid all the normative battles through this, but nevertheless, it should indicate that we want to use secularity as an analytical term and not as a normative concept. What do we mean with secularity is the forms of distinction and differentiation between religious and non-religious practices, spheres, or symbols. And with distinctions, we address the semantics, the symbolic level. With differentiation, we address the institutional level. We use secularity as a heuristic device, one might say, as a tertium comparationis, in order to look for such distinction and differentiations also in times and places where the terminology of the secular has not been explicitly used or was not yet present or could not yet be present. So we would not call this secularity, but nevertheless, we look at them as possible precursors or as present sources of legitimacy for present secularity. Armando Salvatore has, with regard to the ADAP concept, talked of a soft distinction. Other scholars have taken up the notions of zones of neutrality, also with regard to Islam, or looked at the concept of the adiaphora in the Christian tradition, in the missionary tradition, where issues were addressed that were not like under the religious rule or that were not considered to be in opposition with religion. Initially, the concept of multiple secularities developed on the background of a cultural sociology, and we were dealing then with modern national constellations and looking back into the history. What we were addressing at that time was that secularity has different meanings and different underlying values in different places, also within Europe. So France is not the only example, but a very specific one. And it has different meanings if you look at it in a global perspective. The second point that we addressed was that secularity refers to societal constellations in which specific problems are at stake, and we call them reference problems. And it relates to these problems as a solution which is expressed in certain guiding ideas. We came up with 4 ideal types of secularity, and the countries that I give are just, examples. It's not like the country doesn't really equate the ideal type, of course, but in order to give you an impression, the first ideal type was secularity for the sake of individual freedoms and rights, and the history of the United States could stand for that. The second is secularity for the sake of the balance of religious diversity. India would be an example for that, not in its present political situation, but over a longer period of history. The third would be secularity for the sake of societal or national integration and development, and I think France could stand for that, or also Turkey. And the fourth would be secularity for the sake of the independent development of functional domains. You cannot identify this with a specific national constellations, but you find it in different places. One of these orientations can be dominant in a society at the expense of others, but it can also be like the orientations of competing groups within a society, reflecting conflicting perspectives in a field of power. With this Center for Advanced Study, we included other disciplines besides sociology, especially scholars from the history of religion, from different area studies, from Islamic studies. And this created new challenges for comparative research. One question that came up in this bigger project is the question of how can a modern terminology like secularity be used as a heuristic concept for pre-modern contexts without becoming achronical. And the second is how to deal with the relation between possible pre-modern indigenous distinctions and then Western influences that are often aligned with colonial rule and that imply a break. So it was clear that we cannot simply assume linear paths from the past to the present. We did steps in the development of a comparative framework of pre-modern forms of distinction and differentiation, and identified sort of three necessary conditions in order such thing to develop. First, certain activities and groups are being classified under the label of what we today would call religion. In the Japanese context, a scholar of mine is working on Japanese. It's maybe called Kyo, Doho, Shushi, or Monto, and in the Islamic context, we heard about this already. It's deen or related concept. A second step would be the development of oppositional pairs like deen or dunya, obo or bupo in the Japanese context is the sphere of the emperor, in the sphere, the nomosphere of the Buddha, or God and Caesar in the Christian history. And they're used to distinguish forms of activity or forms of loyalty. And then the third step would be the identification of institutional actors that support this this binary structure, that serve as a locus of authority, or that has an interest in the struggle of autonomy and therefore support this the development of these oppositional pairs. And let me now say something very roughly about the historical constellation that we found in the common work of these scholars. And I start with a negative outcome, which is a constellation where secularity only comes with Western or colonial influence and cannot be linked to pre-existing distinctions and differentiations. And it seems that several African contexts would fit into that pattern, where in the colonial encounter, not only Christian missionaries, but also religious secular distinctions entered the picture, which does not mean that these African countries do not work with distinctions, but it's more like the visible and the invisible, and it's nothing that sort of prepares the distinction between secular and religion. Another example is pre-modern China, where on the one hand, we find very early forms of humanistic philosophy, which some of them criticized religion. However, because of a very strong worldly state, but no strong religious institutions opposing the state, similar to the medieval church, no strong religious secular differentiation developed. In other cases, however, and we heard about this, forms of distinction and differentiation obviously existed long before the encounter with the West, like in pre-modern Islam, in pre-modern Buddhism, in pre-modern India, and in pre-modern Judaism. So we have strong conceptual distinctions there between deen and dunya, obo and bupo, God and Caesar, but also religious institutions like Buddhist monasteries, the ulama or the church, with an interest in autonomy which foster differentiation. However, in these contexts, Western forms of religious secular differentiation became influential. in the course of time. So there were contestations over Westernization, which you can see in the Islamic discourse on modernity, with positive and negative views of secular modernity, or which you can see in the Indian discourse on secularism in the present, and we heard about this as well. So I conclude, first, we do not find the same distinctions and differentiations everywhere and at any times. However, we do find distinctions and differentiations related to what we today call religion in many places and at many times. If these distinctions evolve into a secular sphere, or if they are kept under a religious umbrella, under which conditions a secular sphere develops and when, is an empirical, historical question, but it is a possibility. This possibility is sometimes taken and sometimes rejected, and it is often embattled. So we would say secularity is not only a Western asset, and it has pre-modern precursors. And therefore, it is not something that can be or should be erased from the historical arena of options in the non-Western world by claiming, as it often happens, their authenticity, their wholeness, or their incomparability with Western constellations. And if you want, this is our normative agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.